Hello, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce everyone to Deborah Harcourt. And Deborah's got many descriptions and backgrounds that we could put on, but the one that, attracted me to have her for this session is where she calls herself an investigator of the provocations of Reggio, Emilia, and translator of these to the Australian context. Is that a fair idea of a good description for what it is that you do?
Yes, I think so, Lisa, and thank you so much for having me today. It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you again. I guess it comes from many years of reading about Reggio, engaging in dialogue with colleagues. But I guess in 2012, 2013, I was incredibly lucky to be a part of the South Australian Thinker in Residence, where the Premier, Jay Weatherall, at the time invited Professor Carla Rinaldi to come to Adelaide on and off for about 2 years. And I had the great privilege of working side by side with her. And in discussing the principles and the provocations from Reggio Emilia, it really came home to me that you just can't pick them up and plonk them somewhere else. So this was an opportunity for me to see if I could translate them into another context. Having worked in Singapore for 10 years, I had the opportunity to also understand what these might look like in a Chinese context, in an Indian context, in a Middle Eastern context, in an Indonesian context, and then coming back to Australia, really trying to unpack with colleagues what they might look like in our context, whether it be family daycare, long daycare, or kindergarten.
Okay, so let's go back, because some of the educators that will be watching this will be very aware of what Reggio Emilia is, and others will be going, what's that? What are they talking about? So can you just give a very short, and I know it's hard whenever you ask anyone to talk about Reggio Emilia to make it short, but give a very short understanding of what that is, where it is.
Well, basically, Lisa, it's a group of 32 infant and toddler centres and preschools that are situated in the city of Reggio Emilia. So Reggio Emilia is not a person, and Reggio is not married to Emilia. So it is actually a city. And it was born after the Second World War, where parents and families and community were looking for something different away from state-run early learning centres and away from the church. So a group of families came together and sold off, apparently, some of the trucks and the armoured vehicles that were left after the Second World War to fund the start of a preschool. And a few years after that, a man called Loris Malaguzzi, who was based in Rome, who was actually born in a little town near Reggio called Correggio, was really attracted, being a developmental psychologist and an educational psychologist, was really attracted to some of the principles that they were working on. So it's a group of centres that are world-renowned, I guess mostly around their image of child and their focus on the rights of children.
And when I first suggested this topic for this particular PD in a pocket, everyone went, like some of the family daycare people I suggested to said, what does provocation mean? They weren't used to that word. So can you explain what provocations are? And then maybe we can go on to what's the difference between provocations and invitations.
Well, actually, Lisa, that's where I was going to start, because it reminded me of a conversation a couple of years ago in Melbourne, where there were some colleagues from Reggio Emilia who were out for a 3 or 4 day retreat that was held in Melbourne. And it was the first time that we'd actually heard what the difference was between an invitation and a provocation. And it was very, very simple. An invitation is something that is kind, and a provocation is something that makes you think. So I thought that's a beautiful way of describing it without going into a whole heap of philosophical details, as our colleagues in Reggio tend to do, which is great if you have a deep understanding of it, but you get a bit lost, I think, if you're not used to that way of thinking and speaking and listening. So I guess mainly what I see in early childhood centres is invitations for play rather than provocations for play. And an invitation is where our educators and teachers would set up a prompt for children to engage in play, whereas a provocation is, generally speaking, something that is ongoing, where we are connecting back to previous thinking. The educator might propose a curious question or a question of wondering. So I think what we see is an invitation rather than a provocation.
Okay, so let's say that you were to go in, into a family daycare educator's house, and you walked out of there and go, that was beautiful. They had so many wonderful invitations to play set up. What would you expect what sorts of things would you expect to see?
Lisa, the one thing I'd be looking for to start with would be, are the experiences and spaces for children really clear? So if I go in as a child, would I be very clear as to what was around me, what I was being invited to do? I'm thinking more and more about this in all early childhood settings, that perhaps our intention, and if we connect that to the early years learning framework, perhaps our intention is not quite clear, and therefore our expectations may also not be quite clear for children. In addition to that, I would expect to see open-ended resources, those which do not suggest to a child, this is what you do with me, rather suggesting to a child, what can you do with me? So a range of resources and materials, and yes, natural materials have a great space or great place in these spaces, but I don't want people to think just replacing plastic with timber is going to do the trick. It's really about thinking, what is my intention when I'm offering these things to children, whether it's in construction area or the baby play area or the domestic play area, or even what I call now transformational play, which in traditional speak would be dress ups, but offering open-ended materials for that transformation of character, that transformation of identity. So open-ended materials, really clear intention and expectation.
Let's take that dress up. What's an open-ended material in the context of dress ups, and what's a closed material in the context of dress ups?
Okay. If you think about a costume, let's pick Elsa from Frozen, for example. And when I put on that costume, I can immediately become Elsa. But the transformation is quite quick, and I've had no input into thinking about what would it mean to transform myself into Elsa. But what if I was offered a range of beautiful silky blue materials, some sheer materials, a range of shoes, that I could then have a look at those and then think about, how can I transform myself into the character I wish to be, or into the identity I wish to be, by using this range of resources that's been offered to me? So how would I fold a dress to make it in the same vein as what the dress that Elsa wears? How could I use the combination of the silky material and the sheer material together? How would I get the crown on my head? How would I get the floaty sleeves? So it's really about slowing down that transformation for children. And there's the intentionality for educators to come in with questions about, well, how would you fold that? How would we clip that together? How would the soft material go with the transparent material? How would we get that crown to sit on your head? So it's about offering something that slows it down, gives an opportunity for educators and children to sit in dialogue with each other to make that transformation. So the child's actively engaging in it rather than just popping on the costume and off we go.
Okay, what about, say, if you saw a provocation or an invitation that was art-based in an educator's house that you thought, wow, that's really good? What would you see there?
In family daycare, I suppose it's a little bit trickier because you can have a very wide range of age groups of children. So you might have an infant up to just before school. But what I'd like to see educators thinking about in an arts space is, first of all, do the children understand, if we just take drawing and painting as an example, do children understand the relationships between the mark maker, the medium, and the surface? So the mark maker is your paintbrush, for example, and very young children would just use the paintbrush, stick it in their mouth. When they're finished with that, they might be banging it. Then they might be introduced to a medium. And instead of it being paint, think about it as being water, because water tastes different than the dry brush. And when you whack it onto the table or the floor, there might be little spotlets of water that come up. And then the child perhaps might lose interest in that, which is an indication of perhaps introducing a surface, which could be the paintbrush, the water, and the concrete or the bricks outside. So the child understands what the role is between each of those three things. And then we can start to introduce paint, for example, and different surfaces such as perspex or paper. So I'd like to see that there are a range of opportunities for children to explore these things, but to understand the relationship between those three things, the paintbrush, the medium, and the surface, so that we're less likely, I won't say don't, but we're less likely to have those experiences where the child is completely covered in paint, there's paint all over the floor, and it turns out to be a big mess, and the educator says, perhaps I won't do that again for a couple of days because it's just too much trouble.
Deborah, I took this off your Instagram feed. I don't know whether everyone will be able to see it there, but it's a very beautiful setup art arrangement, which has some plants in vases, different, 4 pieces of paper looking at each other. I don't even know what these things are in the middle, and a few textures at each one. Is that, can you talk me through that?
Okay, I'm not sure which one you are referring to there, but I'm going to have a stab. And okay. What I think it is about a mark making experience that's offered to children every day. So I think it's not paper on the table, they are tiles. And what we would be using would be felt tip pens on the markers on those tiles. And the reason why we do that is, once again, we go back to that idea of the mark maker, the medium, and the surface. And what we've discovered with young children, that if we use a surface such as a tile, it's a lot smoother than paper, and the mark maker will travel more quickly across that surface. So we often see children really focusing then on the marks that they're making. So it's not so much about what I can draw, it's about the marks I make. You might also see on that photo, I think, that there'll be a cloth or something like that close by, where the children are practicing their mark making, which means that they can wipe the tile off and they can practice again. They can wipe the tile off and they can practice again until they're happy with what they've marked, made, drawn, written, whatever it is. The provocation in the middle is not so much about draw me, but it's about creating a beautiful space for children. It's about providing an opportunity for, particularly around the arts, particularly around drawing and painting, that if you think about what artists use, you know, out there in the real world, they are attracted to beauty, and they may not necessarily be drawing the whole landscape. They might just be drawing the tree or the flower in front of them, but they immerse themselves in beauty. And that's one of the things that I think is really important for us as educators, to provide opportunities for children, not just the drawing or the mark making as in this case, but to ensure that the invitation that is offered to them is an invitation that is infused with beauty. I hope I've got the right one that you're looking at. But
yeah, it's exactly that one. Yeah. One of the things, like, I really love your Instagram page, and I'll provide people with a link for that.
Thank you.
Because it isn't instructive to educators, and it's not like those horrible Pinterest things where you get overwhelmed with, we could do this and we could do that. I often see, though, educators setting up elaborate setups for children, and I'd call them, yeah, they're not so much provocations or invitations, more like activity areas for children to work in. And I see that the educator is expressing their creativity in setting it up, but they're not necessarily thinking about how children will engage with that space. Is that something you see sometimes, or?
Yes, I see that a lot, Lisa. And again, it comes back to what I was saying before about really understanding what your intention is when you are developing, or what I call curating, a space for children. An example might be, this was in an infant studio last week, and a junior studio, which has children 15, 18 months through to about 3. And the educators had called it the sound corner. So there were lots of big, lots and lots of big tins. There were lots of jars with a whole range of things in them, with the intention that the children would use these to make noise with, make sound with. But as we were watching the children, what we saw was the children were filling up the big tins from the smaller tins, and then carting them away, and then bringing them back and tipping them out, then filling them up and carting them away, and that kind of thing. And what I'd like to suggest to our colleagues in family daycare is around understanding the schemas that children are working on. So, you know, schemas such as transporting, which is what these children were doing. Just all they wanted to do was fill things up, take them somewhere and bring them back again. Or enclosing, which might mean enclosing themselves, getting inside a cupboard, those sorts of things. Because when you understand that the schemas that children are working on, which is a fairly foundational child development kind of knowledge, it's not unattainable knowledge, you then can start to set up things for children that support this, what is theory development for children. How does this work? How do I fit with this? What would happen if I just fill this jar up and take it over there? And I think sometimes we overwhelm children with way too much stuff, when we could really simplify it, take it back to basics, and start to think about, what are the children exploring here? What are they trying to understand? What are they trying to connect to in terms of the world around them? Another example might be something that I see is book corners, or library corners, I suppose, that have got tons and tons of books in them. And it's very difficult for children's brains, especially younger children under the age of 3, to kind of sort out what's what. But if you think about it, my intention is for children to connect with storybooks, books reading for pleasure. But before they can do that, they have to understand what a book is. And they also need to understand the expectation that the books are not to be left all over the floor, to be trodden on or torn or whatever it is. So setting up a library space or a book nook or a book corner, whatever you'd like to call it, with just a few books on it, and perhaps the very special ones, the pop-up ones, the very, very beautiful books that we need to take care of could be sat up high on a shelf where children could indicate, I would really like you to read this book to me, which means I would like some time just with you, just for myself. So it's not so much about the reading, it's about connecting to relationships. So again, it comes back, what is your intention when you're offering children these things? And often, Lisa, less is best, quality over quantity.
Well, you must see, like, I know you work a lot more with centres than with home-based educators, but you must see some really beautiful, educationally beautiful, not physically beautiful, provocations and invitations set up by educators. Could you, thinking back through your memory, talk about some of the things, that have really, that you thought that the educators were thinking deeply about the children that they were working with?
Standing in the doorstep of a family day care home, or standing on the doorstep of a kindergarten, I'd be looking for exactly the same thing. And the first thing I would be looking for is, what does this environment say to me as a child that I am welcome? So how do I see myself when I walk through that door, or I stand on the doorstep and look in? Because it's really important, I think, for children to have a connection. If you think about the very first day that they're there, or something I can keep coming back to that connects me. And it might be something really simple, such as I saw in an infant studio the other day, the rubber duckies that children have in the bath. And They had this little stand with all these little rubber duckies on, with their names on them and their photos underneath, because the children obviously are yet to read. But the first thing that the children did was went and got one of these rubber duckies, and they held onto it as they came into the studio, and they put the duck into a pond. No water in it, pretend pond. They put the duck into the pond, which was like the very young child saying, hello, I'm here. And they actually had something to do when they got there. So getting that little sense of security. And I came in and I popped it in the pond. When they leave in the afternoon, they take it out of the pond and they go outside and they put it back on the beautiful little stand. Really simple things like that just say to a child, hello, you belong. There's their name or their photograph. They've got something to do as soon as they get there. They're not kind of going, which educator is going to come and get me? They're actually more focused on that. So really simple things like that when educators are thinking about how children make that transition from mum and dad or nan and pop or their carer into the home or into the centre, we've really got to think about how they're making that transition in their head from being a member of a family to being a member of a learning community, which is what a family daycare home is. It's a learning community. So how can we help children make that transition? The other thing that I would look for that really makes my heart sing is the way in which the educators have thought about sustainability. And by that, I mean, how have they repurposed furniture? How are they ensuring that they're upholding a sustainability policy? And yes, around things like the use of water and lights and things like that. But how are they moving towards sustainability in terms of things like adhesives and glue and those sorts of things that you can't replace once you've stuck the paper on the cardboard or whatever it is, that's it. So I'd be looking for how is a child welcomed, and around the sustainability issues that I think we really have a ethical and moral responsibility for helping children understand, you know, how do we support our planet, even, you know, big things like that, but do it in really, really small ways.
The last topic that we did in this series was on sustainability, so hopefully everyone's going out there and putting those ideas into practice.
Yeah.
Do you, within the context of a family daycare educator's home, I often see photos where every child is and like we've got a maximum of 4 children under school age. So all 4 children would be working on the one, would be engaged in the one activity. Is that, like, would you expect to see in a house that was set up, or a home that was set up, with good provocations, good invitations, would you expect to see all children working on the same activity at the same time, or would you expect to see a few separate ones happening?
Yeah, I think I would expect to see a combination of both. If we look at the early years learning framework, or perhaps the national quality framework, which is the framework we work under, one of the things that we have drawn from that is that we know that children learn, as they interact with people, places, and things. So it is around opportunities throughout the day to work in small groups, and family daycare is just such an awesome possibility of doing that. However, it's not to say that children want to be doing something with others all day, every day, working on the same thing. So perhaps our colleagues in family daycare could think about opportunities for children to be able to work together, but also many more opportunities for children to work on different things as their requirements allow. The other thing too is, I think, in a family daycare situation where you've perhaps got a 15-month-old through to a 4.5-year-old, it is quite tricky to have things that enable all the children to work together. But, things like a mud kitchen, for example, are a great opportunity for children to work together, or potion play, or perfume play, or things that are really open-ended, where each child has a possibility, or maybe using clay, where the younger child is working more on the muscle development in their upper body, where a 4.5-year-old might have the capacity to make little things out of the clay. So we've got to think about, if we want all the children to be working together, is their ability to work along a line of possibilities here for younger children and older children. So I think, Lisa, a combination, and opportunities for children to just be by themselves for a bit, because it's highly stressful for children to be in an environment with others all day. So those different opportunities would be very important.
So talk to me about craft. What's your feelings about craft in education care settings?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, Lisa. And it's even the words to me sound like it comes out of the 1960s, that word craft. But what I'd like to do is connect it back to our conversation earlier about sustainability. And I'd really like all educators to think about moving away from what I call make and take. So we give children, a stencil or a piece of cardboard that has a drawing on it, and we have an expectation that they'll fill in the gaps for us. They'll put hair on it, or because it's a face, or it's a bird, or something like that. To really thinking about how we can be sustainable with those sorts of things as well. So I've come up with this well, it's not such a new idea now, but I've tried to move away from that idea of make and take and to move into what I call transient art, which means that it's not fixed. So the opportunity for children to work on a surface, and educators that I'm working with at the moment will often use an empty photo frame, picture frame kind of thing, you know, like about that big. And they have a range of materials and resources in front of them, which could be anything from, you know, glass pebbles to sticks to ribbon to, you know, the world's your oyster in terms of what the materials could be. But children begin then to understand about patterning, how they can make patterns with these things. And they then might turn into pictures of things, you know, a landscape or a person or an animal. But the great thing about that is that they then need to put those things back in their right place, in the bowl or the basket or wherever they come from. So they're learning about matching and how you seriate things, how things go into patterns. And it's sustainable because it's not permanent. That you can take a photograph of it so that the child has a memory of it if they need to. But I'd really like educators to move away from this idea of craft because it is unsustainable. And often those craft things come out of a catalogue, which means that you've also spent money on this stuff. Whereas you could take the children for a walk to the local park and with baskets and collect beautiful leaves and pods and sticks and stuff like that and bring it back. But you can have a beautiful surface to work on. So it could be a really beautiful old picture frame and the children develop their pattern or their picture inside of that frame, but it's not stuck onto something. It's not something I'm going to take home. And I remember as a preschool teacher myself, with parents doing the face planting, not another piece of craft to take home. Can we just leave it here? So that idea of sustainability, I think, comes in with all of this stuff, but it's around children understanding that it's not about this make and take, because it happens in about 2 seconds and they're gone, but really understanding that sustainability can be part of your everyday life when you're at your family daycare home.
And what about, one of the things that I often see people like you post is examples of light being used within education care settings. Can you tell me, like, you know, reflection and yeah, can you talk to me about that a bit?
That's a really tricky language to work with, that light, shadow and reflection. And I think one of the things that we need to understand as human beings, and children obviously are human beings, but we tend to only see light from above. The light comes down onto us because that's usually where our lights are in our rooms. That's where the sun is. The sun is up here, the lights are up here, and the light comes down upon us. And that's how we make, you know, shadows on the ground and those sorts of things. But there are lots of different forms of light, and things like light boxes, for example, which are quite popular in many early childhood settings, some of which perhaps don't know how to use them effectively because they're next to a window or, you know, a doorway or something. But those sorts of things then allow children to understand what light looks like when it comes up underneath something, and it might pass through a piece of coloured perspex, or so it looks quite different from underneath than it does from on top. And then we have the good old-fashioned, many of our listeners may not know what an old-fashioned overhead projector is, but back in the day when we used to put transparencies on them, and we do our classes with the transparencies. But what I love about that light is it comes from behind and shines through, which is really tricky because when you're working with that sort of light, you're working on the glass surface of the projector, but you can actually see what you're doing up there on the wall. So that coordination kind of thing is really tricky. So that's the reason why we would use light and shadow. The reflection piece, I think, is really interesting when you're using things like mirrors, those sort of balls that you can get, the kind of flat spheres that you can get, is around the child connecting with themselves, because you can actually obviously see yourself in the mirror. And for human beings, I guess, all of us, whether we're a child or an adult, we don't often see what our face looks like in public when we're with others. We can see our hands moving, we can see our legs moving, but the one place that we can't see is our face. And we use the reflection, whether it's the mirror or the ball, or when I'm talking to someone else, what I say, I can see from their reaction, whether they think it's funny or sad, or they're shocked or whatever it is. So that light and shadow, you can move with, you can think about that with the lights around us, but reflection is something quite interesting, and how very young children learn to understand that what they see in front of them is actually themselves. And I guess our listeners and watchers today will, that they would have seen a little person going up to a mirror and kissing the mirror because they think it's another person. And that's really interesting to watch. So that light.
Sadly, I think that children that have been in lockdown and doing Zooms with their educators would be a lot more used to seeing their own reflection back at them.
Exactly. And my granddaughter, who is 18, well, our only grandchild, but she's 18 months of age, lives in Thirroul, south of Sydney. And she's so used to offering me cups of tea like this, and I'll take a sip and she takes a sip, or she's putting a boot on and I'm putting a boot on. I'm sure she thinks that all of her relatives, both up here in Queensland and in the United Kingdom, just they live like this. So yeah, who knows what light, shadow and reflection will look like in a few years' time when they're in preschool.
One of the things that I think educators can often be a bit scared of is of doing something differently than how they've always done it, trying something differently. If you were not used to setting up deliberate provocations or invitations, if you were more used to going, okay, there's the toys, there's the dress up toys, there's the whatever, how would you slowly bring that into your practice?
I guess I would think about what is it that we've always done in early childhood. So we've always done things like, we have to have a sand pit, we have to have Play-Doh, we have to have dress ups, because that's what we've always done. But how about we rethink what we've always done? So let me give you just one example. So, okay, we've always had Play-Doh. Forever and a day in early childhood, we've always had Play-Doh. But what if we didn't have Play-Doh? Would the sky fall in, like Henny Penny said? Would the world come crashing down around us if we didn't have Play-Doh? But we've got to think about, okay, if we were going to be really brave and courageous and not have Play-Doh anymore, we really have to think about the whys that sit behind it. So why would we want to replace Play-Doh, for example, with clay? So one of the things that I'd like our colleagues to think about is, we go back to that sustainability idea, that Play-Doh is made out of food. And as yet, we can't recycle the Play-Doh. We can't give it to the chickens. Generally speaking, depending on where you live, up here it goes really moldy within a few days because of the humidity. Down south it gets really crackly and horrible, and you can't use it. So that's ecologically, that's one thing. Ethically is another thing. So the ethics are the decisions that you make that perhaps make you feel a bit uncomfortable. So, for example, because Play-Doh is made out of food, and right here in Australia right now, and this is a really good time to be thinking about this, is a lot of our families do not have enough food to feed themselves, to feed their parents, to feed their children. So why would we be offering food to children to play with? And if our listeners and watchers today are anything like me as a parent, one of the things I always said to my children at meal times was, don't play with your food. So we've got all of these things, yet I see time and time again children being offered food to play with, whether it's making potato prints or whether it's Play-Doh or whether it's what did I see the other day? Cutting up oranges and, I don't know, drying them and hanging them off mobiles or whatever the latest trendy thing is. But again, I've got to think out, we've always done that, but that doesn't mean we should always do it. We've always had Play-Doh. It doesn't mean we should always do it. So if I was going to be a brave and courageous person in family daycare, I would choose something that really makes me think about the why. Why do we do this? And what could we offer that is even better for children? And clay is much better for children than when Play-Doh is, purely from a developmental point of view. The other thing about Play-Doh is it has no memory. You can't come back to play with it day in again. You can't start to make something with Play-Doh and add to it as you go along during the week. It hasn't got that memory, whereas clay does. And the other thing to think about is what would be better for children's development if I was going to change anything. And what we know about clay, for example, is it builds those muscles in the hands that children need to be able to eventually go like that and make marks and begin to write. So if I was going to be brave and courageous and change things, I'd start with something like Play-Doh. That would be my go-to. And then I'd do sand pits and swings and forts. But let's just start with Play-Doh.
It sounds like a good place to start. And if people wanted to learn more about provocations, what do you think would be a good place for people to start?
Well, my Instagram is a good place to start if they just want to have a read through, because I try and put the why with everything that I put on there, so they don't just use it as a Pinterest thing and go, well, that looks great. But I think having a network that they can talk to, a network of other family daycare providers, but maybe not even just family daycare, maybe connecting with your local early learning centre or something around that way. But I've always found having a group of people around me that I can talk to, that I could share ideas with, particularly things that are making me feel uncomfortable, that maybe there's a different way of doing this. Reading, there's lots and lots, I guess, for the family daycare teams, books like Margie Carter and Deb Curtis, their books, they've got some amazing, really easily accessible reading. It's not academic, it's not full of theory and stuff like that. So their books are really good. And Lisa, I don't know if you remember Ursula Colby. She used to be at Macquarie University, and her books are just beautiful. They're really accessible around the arts, if you will, and they're really good places to start, because Ursula, like Margie Carter and Deb Curtis, they kind of just make you think a little bit about, oh, what if I did it this way? What if I thought about it this way?
One of the things that educators, family daycare educators, really have, I think, is a really good understanding of the children. Like, they have such intimate knowledge of each of the children that they've been caring with. some of whom they've had from, 6
Yeah.
weeks old up until
Yeah.
school age. How does it help when you really know what your children are like, who those children are? How does that help in setting up provocations for them?
That's a really good question. I'm just trying to think. So little Asta, who I was talking about before, our granddaughter, she goes to a family daycare in Thirroul, and she talks about her family daycare educator all the time. So it's really easy to see that there is a very strong, trusting relationship that goes on between an 18-month-old and her educator. I think what it can do, and I'm going to use a term here that perhaps your educators might not have heard before, and it's called the zone of proximal development. And that basically means this is where the children are starting over here, and this is where you'd like to get the children to. And when you know children really well, it's quite easy to move children through the skills that they would need to have to get them to where you want to go, whether you're talking about the outcomes in the EYLF or some goals that you and the family have set for the children. When you've got a small group of children who you know really well, you can actually, I think you can move the children through their learning at, I'm going to say faster pace, but I don't mean hot housing the children as if they're a plant. I mean, you can, because you're with them all of the time, you can really, I guess, advance their learning because you have that deep relationship with them and within that, in that small group. And working closely with the family who you see every day. It's not like you've got, I work with studios where they have 66 children in the studio with lots and lots of educators, but no one would know the children as well as a family daycare educator would with that small group of children. So I think that knowledge that you have of the children is exceptional in terms of being able to support the child's learning, particularly around language development, and those sorts of things. I think is exceptional in family daycare settings.
Okay, I think that's probably enough. We could keep everyone here all night talking, but I think that's probably as much. Is there anything else you'd like to say specifically to our listeners as educators, as family daycare educators?
I think you're in a awesome environment to be able to. I have this mantra, and it's called "Nothing Without the Child," and I'm hoping that our colleagues in family daycare would be engaging children in everyday life, things like setting the table and cleaning up after themselves and being able to put their own sunscreen on and get their own hat. So if you can involve the children in everyday life where they're learning real life skills alongside of those other learning opportunities that you're offering, I think it shows children how they can participate in the world around them, and that we're doing things with children instead of to children. That would be what I would offer them.
That sounds like a pretty good note to finish on. Thank you very much, Deborah.
You're very welcome, Lisa. It was lovely to talk to you again.